They tell you grief fades with time, that eventually the sharp edges dull and what's left becomes manageable. I believed that for a while, or maybe I needed to believe it. My wife and I were married for 32 years, long enough that our lives weren't separate things anymore. They were one continuous routine, shared jokes, shared silences, shared plans for a retirement we always assumed we'd reach together. Then cancer took her in 2019, slowly, methodically. Like it had a schedule and no interest in mercy. When she died, the house in upstate New York felt haunted, not by her presence but by her absence. Every room echoed. Every habit reminded me she wasn't coming back. I tried staying busy. I tried therapy. I tried telling myself that at 67 I'd already lived most of my life and this was just the quiet final chapter. But quiet can turn poisonous if it goes on too long. I'd done well financially. I retired from a job I was proud of 3 decades in a field that rewarded patience and consistency. Between my investments, pensions, and the house I sold after my wife passed, I had just over $3 million in savings. On paper, I was safe, comfortable, lucky. In real life, I was eating dinner alone at 6 o'clock and falling asleep to the television because silence felt too loud. Mexico wasn't some lifelong dream. It was an idea that crept in slowly: cheaper cost of living, warm weather, a place where retirement didn't feel like waiting. I told myself it was practical. But if I'm honest, it was also an escape. I sold the house, packed what mattered, left behind what didn't, and landed in Mexico with 2 suitcases, a bank account I rarely checked, and no real plan beyond not being where I'd been. At first, it felt like freedom, new streets, new sounds, a language I only half understood. I rented a small apartment because I didn't know where I wanted to settle. I lived modestly, investment income covered my expenses easily, and I didn't want to rush anything. But after the novelty wore off, the loneliness came roaring back. It's a different kind of lonely when you're surrounded by people who don't know your history, when no one knows what you lost, when you're just another older foreigner walking past cafes filled with couples and families. That's when the taco place entered my life. It was popular, always busy. The kind of place locals lined up for, which I took as a good sign: plastic chairs, chipped tables, smells that made your stomach growl before you even saw the menu. I went the first time because it was close to my apartment and I was tired of cooking for one. She was working the counter, 23 maybe, young enough that the age difference should have scared me more than it did. She wore her hair pulled back, moved fast, smiled easily. Not flirtatious in the obvious way, just warm, polite, the kind of friendly that can feel personal when you're starving for connection. The first time I ordered tacos and left. The second time the same. By the third visit, she remembered my order. Con to do. She asked, already reaching for the tortillas. I nodded, surprised she remembered. She smiled, just a quick one. But it stuck with me longer than it should have. I started going more often, told myself it was because the food was good, and it was. But if I'm being honest, I timed my visits around her shifts. I watched for her without meaning to. I listened for her laugh. After 6 visits, I still hadn't said anything beyond basic pleasantries. I'd heard the stories, older foreigners. Young local women, money, manipulation. I told myself I wasn't that guy, that I was just enjoying a friendly face in a new place. Then one afternoon, as I was paying, she surprised me. "You come here a lot," she said, smiling as she handed me my change. "You don't get tired of tacos." Oh, I laughed, "Not these." She hesitated just for a second, then said, "Maybe next time you don't eat alone." I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not excitement exactly, hope, dangerous, quiet hope. We went for coffee 2 days later, just coffee. She told me about her neighborhood, one of the poorer parts of the city, about growing up sharing rooms, about helping her parents since she was a teenager, about how working at the restaurant was better than nothing, but not something she wanted forever. She asked about me, really asked, about my wife, about my life before Mexico. I told her more than I planned to. She listened without interrupting. That's how it started. We dated for 3 months. Slowly at first, walks, meals, long conversations. I never led with money, never talked about my savings. She knew I was retired, knew I lived comfortably, but I downplayed everything. I was still renting my small apartment. I told her I wasn't sure where I wanted to settle yet. That felt true. She was kind, attentive, beautiful in a way that made me feel foolish for noticing. She held my hand like it meant something. She introduced me to friends. She didn't ask for gifts or money, and that made me trust her more than I probably should have. Eventually, I asked her to move in. She didn't say no. She said her family wouldn't allow it. Her parents were traditional, Catholic. In their eyes, living together meant marriage. Anything else would bring shame. I remember sitting there weighing it. 67 years old, widower, $3 million in the bank. A young woman who made me feel alive again. Marriage didn't scare me. I'd done it before and done it well. She told me that if we were going to marry, her family would expect a real wedding, a big one, not courthouse paperwork, a celebration that honored them. I didn't see the problem. I told myself money was meant to be used, that I couldn't take it with me, that love, real love, was worth investing in. The wedding cost me about 60,000 US dollars. I didn't blink. Her family cried. Her parents thanked me. People called me generous, lucky, brave. Standing there watching her smile in her dress, I believed I had made the right choice. I had no idea that this was the moment my life quietly shifted from choice to consequence. And I had no idea how expensive hope could become when it's fed instead of questioned. The first month of marriage felt like a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. We didn't rush into anything right away. I was still renting my small apartment and she stayed with me there after the wedding. It wasn't romantic in the way people imagine newlyweds living in some dream home. It was cramped, one bedroom, thin walls, but I didn't mind. After years of emptiness, sharing space with another person felt like a luxury. She called me Amber in the mornings, made coffee the way I liked it, strong and bitter. She laughed at my Spanish mistakes and corrected me patiently. At night, she'd talk about the future, our future, with a certainty that was both comforting and unsettling. She talked about a house almost immediately, not aggressively, not demanding, just assumed. A real house, she'd say casually, for us, for when my parents visit, for when we have children. Children at 67, that word landed oddly. I didn't plan on having more kids. I didn't even know if I could, but I didn't challenge her. I told myself she was young, dreaming out loud. It didn't mean anything yet. We started looking anyway. At first, I assumed we'd find something modest, a small house, 2 bedrooms, something practical. I wasn't trying to live like a king. I wanted comfort, not excess. The first few places we saw matched what I had in mind. Simple homes, decent neighborhoods, prices that made sense. She didn't like any of them. Too small, too far, not nice enough. I told myself she was adjusting, that someone who grew up poor might want space once they finally had a choice. Then she started showing me listings herself. Large houses, gated areas, 5 bedrooms, high walls, modern kitchens, prices that made my stomach tighten even before I did the conversion. One house stood out to her immediately, 15 million pesos, roughly 800,000 US dollars. I remember sitting at the table with my laptop open, staring at the number like it might change if I blinked enough times. "That's a lot," I said carefully. She frowned, not angry, just disappointed. "But it's for our future, and you can afford it, no." There it was, the first time she said it out loud. I told her it was more than I was comfortable spending, that I wanted to be careful. That I'd worked too hard to be reckless now. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet tears and a trembling voice. She told me she'd imagined a different life after marriage, that she'd told her parents we were doing well, that people already assumed things. I felt something familiar tighten in my chest, shame, not because I'd done something wrong, but because I didn't want to disappoint her. We argued for the first time that week. Small arguments at first, then longer ones. She'd pull away, grow quiet. I'd apologize just to restore the peace even when I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Eventually, I caved. I told myself this was why I saved money, that even after buying the house, I'd still be comfortable. That I wasn't choosing between security and love, I was choosing to share what I'd built. We made an offer, it was accepted. That's when the next conversation happened. The one that, looking back, should have stopped everything. She told me that legally it made more sense for the house to be in her name. Foreigners can't own property in the same way in Mexico. I knew that. There are trusts, structures, workarounds. She explained patiently that putting it in her name would be simpler. Less paperwork. Less hassle, safer for us, she said, because we're married. I hesitated, not because I didn't trust her, that's what I told myself, but because some quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that this was irreversible. She reassured me, told me I was being paranoid. That marriage meant partnership, that she'd never betray me. I signed. The house was beautiful, I won't pretend it was. 5 bedrooms, high ceilings, a courtyard that caught the afternoon light, a kitchen bigger than my old living room back in New York. It felt absurd, like a reward I hadn't earned in this chapter of my life. We moved in, and for a week it felt like a dream. Then her parents came to visit. I expected a weekend, maybe a week. They brought bags, then more bags. They cooked. They rearranged things. They spoke rapidly in Spanish around me, smiling politely when I entered the room. After 3 weeks, they were still there. I asked her gently when they were planning to go home. She avoided my eyes. That's when she told me the truth. They'd rented out their house. Signed a lease, taken the money, they weren't visiting, they'd moved in, and she had known the entire time. I remember the sound my heart made in my ears, like rushing water, like something collapsing. You didn't think to ask me. I said. She shrugged, defensive now. Their family, where else would they go? That was the moment I realized the house wasn't ours, it was hers. And by extension theirs. Expenses multiplied overnight: groceries, utilities, repairs. Then came the car. She needed one, she said, to get to work, to help her parents. A new one, not used, safer, better. Then furniture. The house needed to look right. Appliances, upgrades, always reasonable on their own, crushing together. I paid for everything. I told myself it was temporary. That once things settled, we'd find balance, but balance never came. I started spending without thinking, wiring money, swiping cards, watching numbers shrink in a way I hadn't seen since my wife's medical bills years earlier. And with every payment, something else disappeared too. My voice, my place, my sense of belonging in the very house I'd bought. I began sleeping in the guest room. Then one night, after another argument I didn't win, I packed a bag. I told myself it was just to get space. I didn't know then that I was already gone, and that everything I'd paid for was staying right where it was without me. I told myself I was just taking a break. That's how it always starts. You convince yourself the distance is temporary, that space will cool things down, that perspective will fix what exhaustion can't. I rented a small apartment a few neighborhoods away, nothing fancy, just clean and quiet. The kind of place that feels invisible, which was exactly how I felt at that point. I left most of my clothes at the house, my books, my personal things. I didn't want it to feel like I was leaving for good. She didn't stop me. That should have told me everything. At first, she called every day, asked how I was, told me she missed me, said her parents were just settling in, that it wouldn't be forever. She said the tension was stress, nothing more, marriage adjustments, cultural differences. I wanted to believe her. I'd already crossed so many lines I never thought I would. What was one more act of faith? I kept paying for everything. The mortgage equivalent payments, utilities, internet, groceries. Her parents didn't work. Why would they? They didn't need to. The house was paid for. The fridge was full. The bills were handled by a man who wasn't even sleeping there anymore. She asked for money like it was normal, casual, text messages in the middle of the day. We need money for repairs. My mom needs something for her health. The car payment is due. Always we. Always need. Never can we talk about this. I started to notice that when I questioned anything, even gently, she grew distant, cold, not angry, worse, indifferent, like my concerns were an inconvenience instead of a warning. I went back to the house one afternoon unannounced, not to confront anyone. I just wanted to see it, to remind myself it was real. Her parents were sitting in the living room watching television, my furniture. They nodded politely like I was a guest, not a husband, not an owner. She wasn't home. I walked through the rooms slowly. 5 bedrooms, and not one of them felt like mine anymore. Closets filled with clothes I didn't recognize, drawers reorganized, family photos on the walls that didn't include me. I realized then that I hadn't just moved out, I'd been replaced. That night I asked her to meet me for dinner, neutral ground, a cafe we used to like before marriage complicated everything. She was late. When she arrived, she looked tired but unbothered, like someone already detached from the outcome. I can't keep doing this, I said. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse, I just stated it. She sighed. Doing what? Paying for a life I don't get to live, I said. A house I don't feel welcome in, decisions I'm not part of. She leaned back, crossed her arms. This is marriage, she said. You knew my family was important. Important doesn't mean unlimited, I replied. That's when she said the sentence that finally stripped the illusion away. You're acting like this is your money. I stared at her. It is my money, I said slowly. She shook her head. No, it's ours now. That's what marriage means. That word, ours, felt heavier than any accusation. I tried to explain that I needed boundaries, that I needed respect, that I needed to feel like a partner, not a resource. She listened quietly. Then she said, if you didn't want this responsibility, you shouldn't have married someone like me. Someone like me. I realized then that she wasn't confused about what was happening. She was comfortable with it. The arguments escalated after that, not explosive fights, cold ones, calculated. She began keeping track of what she thought she was owed, reminding me of the wedding, the house, the sacrifices she'd made. She started talking about security, about her future, about how unstable things felt when I wasn't fully present. And then she said it. I need to know the house is safe, she told me. That no matter what happens between us, my family won't be on the street. I knew what she was really saying. She wanted guarantees. I said no. That's when the tone shifted completely. She stopped calling, stopped asking how I was. Communication became formal, transactional, messages about bills, about needs, about expectations. I found out later through a lawyer that she'd already been preparing documents, advice, conversations I wasn't part of. The house was in her name, legally, cleanly, there was no dispute there. The money trail was complicated: gifts, shared expenses, marital support. Enough gray area to drain years and hundreds of thousands in legal fees if I fought. I sat with an attorney who explained my options in calm, practiced language. You can pursue it, he said, but realistically, you'll spend a fortune trying to recover a fraction, and there's no guarantee. How much have I lost? I asked. He did some quick math. Between the wedding, the house, the car, the furnishings, the monthly support, the transfers I barely remembered approving. Just over $500,000, gone, not stolen in a dramatic sense, not taken by force, redirected. I left the office feeling numb. I stopped paying. That was the line I finally drew. Within a week, she called me furious, accused me of abandonment, of betrayal, of trying to punish her family. I didn't argue. I just said, I can't do this anymore. She laughed, not cruelly, almost kindly. You'll be fine, she said. You still have money. That was it. That was the moment I understood exactly who I was to her, not a husband, a balance sheet. The legal separation followed quickly, efficiently, quietly. She didn't fight for reconciliation. She fought for clarity, and she got it. I moved fully into my apartment, bought new clothes, new dishes, new routines. I was 67 years old, living alone in Mexico again, only now I carried a different kind of weight. I wasn't grieving a wife lost to cancer anymore. I was grieving the version of myself that believed love could be bought without consequence. And the hardest part wasn't the money. It was realizing that at no point in the collapse did she ever ask if I was okay. Not once. I don't know when I stopped hoping. I just know that one morning I woke up and didn't check my phone. And that's when I knew the marriage was truly over. After I stopped paying, everything went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No angry messages, no long explanations. Just a clean absence, like someone closing a door without slamming it. That silence told me more than any argument ever had. She wasn't confused, she wasn't hurt, she was recalculating. I spent a lot of time alone in that apartment. Same city, same country, entirely different life. I walked the same streets I'd walked when I first arrived in Mexico, but they felt smaller now, less forgiving. Back then, I was a widower looking for air. Now I was a man who had made the same mistake twice in two very different ways. I tried not to think about the house. That was the hardest part. I'd drive past the neighborhood sometimes without meaning to. The high walls, the gates, the illusion of permanence. I'd imagine her parents inside, settled into routines I paid for. Morning coffee in a kitchen I chose, evenings in a living room I furnished. My life playing on in the background without me. I spoke to another lawyer, then another. Each conversation ended the same way. The house was in her name. The money transfers were framed as marital support. The wedding expenses were gifts. The car was a gift. The furniture was a gift. Legally, one attorney told me, you were generous. Generous, that word felt like salt in an open wound. I could fight. I could drag it out. I could spend years chasing a sense of justice that might never arrive, or I could accept what had already happened and stop the bleeding. I chose the second option. The final paperwork was signed quietly. No courtroom drama, no emotional speeches. Just signatures and stamps and a strange sense of unreality. 32 years married to my first wife, and we needed lawyers only once at the very end. This marriage lasted less than a year and unraveled like a business contract gone wrong. After it was official, she sent me one last message. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't apologetic, it was practical. She thanked me for what I'd done for her family, said she hoped I found peace, told me she was grateful for the opportunity I'd given her. No mention of love, no mention of loss, just gratitude. I stared at that message for a long time before deleting it. That's when the anger finally arrived, not explosive anger, not the kind that makes you shout. The kind that settles in your chest and makes everything taste bitter. Anger at myself for ignoring every warning sign, for confusing youth with sincerity, for believing that being needed meant being chosen. I thought about my first wife constantly during that time. She never asked me to save her, never measured my worth, what I could provide. We built our life slowly, together. There was no imbalance because there was no transaction. I realized how far I drifted from that version of love. Loneliness didn't just make me vulnerable, it rewired my judgment. It made me impatient. It made me believe that intensity was the same thing as intimacy. I went back to the taco place once. I don't know why, curiosity maybe, or some twisted need to prove to myself that it hadn't all been a fantasy. She wasn't there. Different staff, same smells, same. I ordered tacos and sat alone, watching people come and go. Couples, families, old men laughing with friends. No one looked at me twice. I paid and left without finishing my food. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment and took stock of what was left. I was down roughly $500,000, more than I ever imagined losing in retirement, enough to hurt but not enough to ruin me. I still had savings, investments, income. I was still objectively comfortable. But comfort without trust feels hollow. I stopped dating entirely, not out of bitterness, out of caution. I didn't trust my own instincts anymore. Every smile felt suspicious. Every kindness felt like a calculation waiting to reveal itself. Friends back home told me I should come back to the States. Start over, they said. At least there you know the rules. But Mexico wasn't the problem. I'd come here looking for relief from grief and found a shortcut instead. I'd skipped the hard part, learning how to be alone again, and tried to replace it with companionship that came with conditions I didn't fully understand. I started living smaller again, cooked my own meals, walked more, spent time reading instead of scrolling. I learned how to sit with quiet without treating it like an enemy. Some nights were harder than others. There were moments, usually late, when I'd replay the early days with her. The tacos, the smiles, the feeling of being seen. I wondered how much of it was real, how much of it was performance, and whether the difference even mattered in the end. Because the outcome was the same. I gave trust where it wasn't earned, and I paid for it with pieces of my future. The hardest realization wasn't that she took advantage of me. It was that I offered myself up for it. I ignored the age gap, ignored the power imbalance, ignored the speed, ignored the way money entered every conversation eventually, even when it was disguised as tradition or family or love. I told myself I was being generous. What I was actually being was afraid. Afraid of dying alone, afraid of sitting in silence again, afraid of feeling invisible. Those fears cost me more than money ever could. I don't hate her. I don't even resent her family anymore. They played their roles. I played mine. The difference is they knew exactly what game they were in. I did. By the time I understood, the board was already cleared. Now when people ask me what happened, why I'm still in Mexico, why I live alone, why I never mention my wife, I give them the short version. I made a bad decision, I say, and I paid for it. What I don't say is how close I came to losing myself entirely. How easily love becomes leverage when desperation enters the room. How fast a lifetime of discipline can unravel when you convince yourself this time is different. I learned that lesson too late to undo the damage, but early enough to stop it from destroying everything. I still wake up every morning in that small apartment, still drink my coffee alone, still watch the city come alive outside my window. The loneliness hasn't disappeared. But it's honest now. And honesty, I've learned, is a lot cheaper than hope when hope is being sold to you. One section left, and that's where the real reckoning lies. There's a moment after everything collapses when the noise stops. No more arguments, no more negotiations, no more explanations that twist themselves into knots, just silence in the numbers. I lost a little over $500,000 in cash. That wasn't the house. That was everything else. The wedding. $60,000 gone in a single day so her family could celebrate properly. The car, she said, was necessary. The furniture that had to match the house, the monthly support for her parents, the quiet transfers that started small and became routine, the emergencies, the favors. The promises that always came with a smile and a kiss and the assurance that this was just how families worked. By the time I realized what was happening, $500,000 had already vanished. And then there was the house, 15 million pesos. At the time, the exchange rate made it feel abstract, less real, just numbers on a page. But in US dollars, it was a massive chunk of my retirement. And because it was in her name, because I trusted her, because she told me it was safer, simpler, smarter, it was never mine, not legally, not emotionally, not even symbolically. When I finally moved out, I didn't take furniture, I didn't argue over property, I didn't threaten lawyers or make scenes. I packed my clothes, a few personal items, and whatever dignity I could still carry. I walked away from a beautiful 5-bedroom house that I paid for but never owned. Between the cash losses and the property, the damage was staggering. More than I ever imagined I'd lose in my lifetime, not through bad investments or medical bills or market crashes, but through love, or what I thought was love. On paper, I survived it. I still had savings, still had investment income, still had enough to live comfortably if I stayed disciplined. but surviving isn't the same as being whole. I was 67 years old, back in a small apartment, staring at white walls that echoed every decision I'd made. Mexico hadn't betrayed me, I had betrayed myself. I came here carrying grief I never finished unpacking. I lost my wife of 32 years to cancer in 2019, and instead of learning how to live without her, I tried to replace the feelings she gave me, the sense of belonging, of being needed, of having someone waiting for me at the end of the day. The young woman at the taco stand didn't create that wound. She stepped into it. I stayed in Mexico after everything ended, not because it was easy, because leaving felt like pretending none of it mattered. I downsized intentionally this time. Set boundaries I should have had from the beginning. I stopped living like my money was infinite and started treating it like what it actually was, the last line of defense between stability and regret. I don't date anymore, not because I hate women, not because I'm bitter, but because I finally understand how vulnerable loneliness makes you, especially when you have resources and time and a heart that still wants connection. Sometimes people ask if I regret it. Yes, I regret the money, I regret the house, I regret ignoring the warning signs, but I don't regret learning the truth. She wanted security for her family, I wanted companionship for myself. Those desires weren't equal, they weren't compatible. In pretending they were cost me more than money, it cost me trust in my own judgment. I don't hate her. Hate would mean she took something without my consent, but I signed the papers. I wired the money. I nodded when I should have paused. I gave. Now I live quietly. I walk. I read. I cook for myself. I watch the city move without trying to anchor myself to it. I've learned that being alone isn't the same as being empty. What empties you is lying to yourself. If there's one thing I would say to any man listening, especially men my age, it's this. Don't confuse attention with intention. Don't confuse gratitude with love, and never give someone power over your future before they've shown you how they handle power at all. I lost over $500,000 in cash. I lost a house I'll never get back, but the most expensive thing I paid for was clarity. And at my age, clarity is worth protecting, because it's the only thing I can't afford to lose again.